So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Cannon, and I'm JNP's chair. A warm welcome to you all for JNP's second webinar, Zionism's Christian Soldiers. I'm honoured that Stephen Sizer, an Anglican priest, has agreed to talk about his book of the same title. Stephen is the founder and director of Peacemaker Trust, which is dedicated to peacemaking, especially where minorities are persecuted, justice is denied, human rights are suppressed, or reconciliation is needed. Stephen will be interviewed by Dr. Les Levidow from JNP's steering group. During the webinar, you are encouraged to submit questions by chat, which will be monitored by Professor Haim Rashid, also from JNP's steering group, who will select and pass on to me to ask at the end of the webinar. So, without further ado, I pass over to Les.
So, Stephen, thanks for joining us today. I hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to share my screen so I can start my PowerPoint. I'm a visual guy and I like to talk from slides. Can you see my presentation?
Oh, yes.
Good.
Yes.
So we're looking at the role Christians have played in the birth of Zionism and the proliferation and the influence of Zionism today. If we begin with the definition, this is a quote from Donald Wagner. He said, Christian Zionism is a movement within Protestant Christianity that views the modern state of Israel as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, thus deserving our unconditional economic, moral, political, and theological support. So Christian Zionism is a religious movement, and it's born out of a conviction that the Bible mandates Zionism today. Now, there is an element of Christian Zionism within Roman Catholicism and some of the other non-reformed denominations, but it's predominantly an evangelical movement. It began in the UK, mutated to the US and British colonies around the world in the 19th century, and is the reason why we have such a close relationship between the US and Israel today. It really goes back to the beginning of the 19th century. Napoleon Bonaparte was the first world ruler to promise the Jews a homeland in over 2,000 years. He was seeking to defeat the British and the Ottomans, and he promised basically the Jewish people a homeland in Palestine. And he wasn't able to deliver, but he sparked a dramatic shift in Christian circles, viewing the Middle East, viewing the Jewish people, and their view of the future, eschatology. And a group of evangelical clergy began to meet in Albury in the late 1820s. Henry Drummond was the High Sheriff of Surrey. He was a wealthy banker, and he invited leading evangelical ministers to join him, along with the Prime Minister's son and other politicians, to speculate about how Napoleon's pledge, in any sense, fitted into their view of the future, and what was Britain's destiny, if you like, Britain's manifest destiny. And out of that group of clergy, we find the rise of Adventism, Pentecostalism, and a number of other groups like the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses. They all really came out of the mid 19th century, such that you find leading politicians such as Lord Shaftesbury in 1840 lobbying other Protestant monarchs in Europe, in Germany particularly, to help restore the Jewish people to the land of Palestine. So I don't call this movement a Christian Zionist movement yet, because the term hadn't been coined until the 1870s, 1880s. But it was really a restorationist movement underwritten by Christians who believed that it was their destiny to assist the Jewish people back to Palestine. And although Herzl didn't come up with the phrase "a land of no people for a people with no land," he's popularly associated with it. The seeds of that concept can be traced back 50 years earlier to Lord Shaftesbury, who said, "A country without a nation for a nation without a country." And the point I'm trying to make now is basically Christian Restorationism undergirded Jewish Zionism by at least 50 years. So, for example, when Herzl wrote his Jewish State, published in 1896, 2 years earlier, a colleague of his, William Heschler, who was the Anglican chaplain to the English embassy in Vienna, he wrote his book, The Restoration of the Jews to Palestine. And although Herzl's concept was largely secular, Heschler's was religious, based on his interpretation of the Bible and prophecy. And it's quite interesting. If you look at histories of Zionism, you very rarely find any credit given to Christians in the birth of Zionism. But in Herzl's own diary, you find this quote: "The Reverend William Heschler, chaplain of the English embassy, who came to see me, a sympathetic, gentle fellow with a long grey beard of a prophet. He's enthusiastic about my solution of the Jewish question." Notice, he says, "We have prepared the ground for you, we Christians." Heschler said triumphantly, "I take him as a naive visionary. He gives me excellent advice, full of unmistakable, genuine goodwill. He is at once clever and mystical, cunning and naive." Everything you look for in an Anglican priest today. But basically, Heschler facilitated meetings for Theodor Herzl and his colleagues with the Grand Duke of Baden, with the German Kaiser, with British political figures, to help open the door to this idea that Britain would eventually provide a home for the Jewish people within the British Empire. Hence, the Balfour Declaration was the summation of this early 19th century movement. Benjamin Netanyahu acknowledges the significance of Christian Zionism in this quote, 2012. He said, "I don't believe that the Jewish state and modern Zionism would have been possible without Christian Zionism." Do you see that? Now, today we can identify at least 3 different strands of Christian Zionism. You have the Messianic, which is committed to Judaism and Zionism from an evangelistic point of view. Jews for Jesus, the church's ministry among Jewish people, and so on. And in fact, on Jews for Jesus' website, they talk about out-Zioning the Zionists. They want to impress their fellow Jews that they are loyal to the Jewish state, but they have an evangelistic agenda. Then you have the apocalyptic Christian Zionists, for whom the Jews sadly are a pawn in their view of the future. You particularly find Pentecostal leaders, the prosperity gospel leaders, television evangelists. Gershon Gorenberg, in his book, At the End of Days, he says, "The problem for us Jews is we're Act 3 in your 4-act play." And this is typical of apocalyptic Christian Zionism. And then you have the much more pragmatic political lobbying movement, and I'll come to that in a moment, that disavows evangelism, that disavows a rather bleak future for the Jewish people and Israel, and is working much, much more closely with the Israeli government and the Zionist movement in the States particularly. So at least 3 strands within this movement. John Hagee epitomizes contemporary Christian Zionism when he says, "The sleeping giant of Christian Zionism has awakened. There are 50 million Christians standing up and applauding Israel. Think of our future together. 50 million evangelicals joining in common cause with 5 million Jewish people in America on behalf of Israel as a match made in heaven." Now, he's not exaggerating, but if you factor in the rest of the world, you can see that this movement, popular in South Africa, Sweden, Holland, European countries, but increasingly China too, dwarfs the Jewish Zionist movement. I would argue at least 9 out of every 10 Zionists are Christians. So I've tried to help you to see that the historically Christian Restorationism and Christian Zionism preceded and facilitated the birth of the Zionist movement, and that today the vast majority of Zionists are not Jewish but Christian. Now, what I want to do now is just develop their agenda, their political agenda, because theology has feet. What you believe affects how you behave. And because Christian Zionists believe that Israel today is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy going right back to Abraham, they naturally want to lobby on behalf of Israel. Now, these are probably the 5 largest, most influential Christian Zionist organizations in the world today, and they are truly global. Christian Friends of Israel, International Christian Embassy, Bridges for Peace, Jerusalem Prayer Team, Christians United for Israel. Those are the largest, but here in the UK, we have each of those organizations operating. They have their franchises, but we also have our peculiarly British version. We have Anglican Friends of Israel, Catholics for Israel, Baptists for Israel, Quaker Friends of Israel, Pentecostal Focus on Israel. And what these folk do is that they challenge and neutralize those of us calling for the rule of international law, holding Israel accountable to the United Nations, or calling for equal rights for Palestinians as well as Israelis. These are the organizations that will challenge and seek to neutralize statements by the mainstream denominations critical of Zionism. The second element of their agenda is funding the emigration of Jews to Palestine. You have the International Christian Embassy since 1980 has been funding thousands and thousands of Russian Jews, particularly since the fall of the Iron Curtain, but more recently in Africa, helping to fund, helping to pay off the debts, pay for the flights, food, clothing, transportation, and resettlement, typically in the settlements in the occupied territories. And the most recent aspect of this movement has been assisting Ethiopian Jews to make Aliyah. Third element of their strategy is to support the illegal settlements of the occupied territories. So the leading organization in this work is called the Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, CFOIC. And they have in the past helped to fund buses to assist the children of settlers to travel to school, armor-plated buses. They've encouraged churches to adopt a settlement. Now, if you think that's eccentric, bear in mind that sometimes a settlement might only have 50 or 100 members, but the church might have 20 or 30,000 members. So you see where the power lies. Their more recent activities involving supporting and helping to fund Israeli soldiers, particularly soldiers that have come from the US to serve in the Israeli army to express their loyalty to Zionism. Messianic Jewish Israel Fund, Christian organization helping to fund the settlements. And the decision of Donald Trump to recognize the settlements as part of Israel was the summation of this work. Fourth element, moving of embassies to Jerusalem. As you know, that apart from the US and a few other small states, every other country in the world has its embassy in Tel Aviv. But since 1980, the International Christian Embassy has been lobbying the US, lobbying other countries to move their embassies to Jerusalem. And this actually was the home of Edward Said's family, which has become the home of the International Christian Embassy. Donald Trump, one of his campaign speeches, promised to move the US Embassy to Jerusalem. And that happened quite recently. But notice this quote from Donald Trump. It's quite significant. He says, quote, "We moved the capital of Israel to Jerusalem." Notice what he's saying. He moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem, but de facto, it was moving the capital. And that's for the evangelicals. You know, it's amazing, he said. The evangelicals are more excited by that than the Jews. He's observing the influence of Christian Zionism in this political movement. Fifth element of their agenda is accusing critics of anti-Semitism. Increasingly, as you will know, anti-Zionism is equated with anti-Semitism. And quite recently, Mike Pompeo made a statement to this effect when he was visiting Jerusalem. Lord Sachs made the same statement recently. Anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. And the Church of England quite recently adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. How that will play out and influence what we can and cannot do within the church is for the future. And then surprisingly, you may find, but it's a fact, there is support within the Zionism, within the Christian Zionist movement for the Temple Mount movement. This is the movement that wants to rebuild the Jewish temple. Because within Christian theology, there is a belief that the Messiah will not come unless the temple is rebuilt so that it can be desecrated prior to his return. And you'll find Christian writers like Thomas Ice, Randall Price, Thomas Horn, churning out books about the temple and its imminent rebuilding. Gershon Solomon is the founder of the Temple Mount Faithful, and he's a guest speaker in many Christian churches today. He's seen as a hero because he is committed to achieving that end. In an interview in the London Times a few years ago, he said, the Israeli government must do it. We must have a war. The Messiah will not come by himself. We should bring him by fighting. This is the same attitude we find in the Zealots of the first century, challenging the Roman Empire. And on the day when the destruction of the temple is mourned, usually in July, Gershon Solomon and his movement brings an articulated lorry into Jerusalem to attempt to lay the cornerstones of a future temple. And then finally, fueling the conflict. Most regrettably, if you walk into a Christian bookstore these days, these are the kinds of books you will find that deal with the future, eschatology. And they are typically apocalyptic, very antagonistic toward Arabs, toward Muslims, and have a very cynical view about the peace process. This is a quote a few years ago from John Hagee. He said, "It is 1938. Iran is Germany. Ahmadinejad is the new Hitler. We must stop Iran's nuclear threat and stand boldly with Israel." He said, "Iran is a clear and present danger to the United States of America and Israel, and that it's time for our country to consider a military preemptive strike against Iran if they will not yield to diplomacy." The assassination this week of a top Iranian nuclear scientist is an indication of how a quote like this can be so dangerous. I've given you a flavor for their political agenda based on their understanding of scripture and based on the historical roots of this movement. I'm delighted that you're interested in my books. They're both out of print. Various Zionists lobbied my publishers to cease publishing the books, and sadly they were successful. But all of my books are available on my website, so you can access the text. Christian Zionism was my PhD thesis, looking at historical roots, theological basis, and political agenda. And then Zion's Christian Soldiers looks much more at how the Bible is misinterpreted and how Christian Zionism can be easily deconstructed by reading the Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures correctly. So check out my website if you'd like to know more. Look under books and you'll have access to much, much more in the way of resources than I've been able to cover this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. That's great. So that sets the stage for some questions I'd like to ask. Let's go back a century to the period of the Balfour Declaration. Although his name is well known, perhaps it's less well known that a decade before his declaration as prime minister, he promoted the 1905 Aliens Act, designed to block immigration of Jewish refugees, mainly from Tsarist pogroms in Russia. Why? Well, like many other of the elite in Britain, he wanted them to go to Palestine instead. He warned against, quote, the undoubted evils that had fallen upon the country, meaning Britain, from an immigration that was largely Jewish. Now, Balfour was at least influenced by Christian Zionism, which historians have called philo-Semitism. I mean, almost the opposite of anti-Semitism. I mean, in the sense of restoring Jews to their supposedly ancient homeland. So I want to ask a general question from that Balfour quote. I mean, how did he perhaps personify a broader anti-Semitic view, certainly shaping the anti-immigration law, but perhaps also shaping the attitudes towards Jews in general as not belonging in Britain?
I think I understand what was happening at the time, largely in terms of the geopolitical dimension. The Jews were part of the solution, as I'm sure you're aware. Britain and Germany were at loggerheads in the First World War, and just as a century earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte had tried to garner the support of the Jewish community to help defeat the British. During the First World War, Britain was seeking the support of the Jewish community to help defeat the Germans. And Germany was exploring, offering the Jews a homeland just as Britain was. But we also know that prior to the Balfour Declaration being published, Britain had already entered a secret deal with the French to split the Middle East between the British and the French empires, having defeated Germany. That was 1915. So what was promised in the Balfour Declaration was a home for the Jewish people within the British Empire. And that suited Britain's geopolitical interests in defeating Germany, defeating the Ottomans, taking over the land bridge to India and to Africa to expand our empire. And it also, through the declaration, while it promised the Jews a homeland in Palestine, it also promised to respect the rights of Jews in other countries who didn't want to go and live in Palestine. And so you find in the declaration an attempt to placate those Jewish people in Britain and other countries who didn't want to be forced to go and live in Palestine, because they recognized, the Zionist organization recognized, that the Balfour Declaration could be used by anti-Semites to get rid of Jews. So you have his personal prejudice toward Jewish people, but his, if you like, his greater ambition to defeat the Germans and solidify Britain's control of Palestine. So therefore, the Jewish community in Palestine was seen as helping to further that agenda.
Yes, of course.
So you find anti-Semites and philo-Semites both committed to the Balfour Declaration. Or
perhaps there is some subtle link between philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism. Now, if philo-Semitism means simply wanting to help the Jews restore their nation or their people to the Holy Land, because that overlaps with preventing them from coming to Britain at that time.
Yes. It was a home, not a state. That's the essential thing. Britain in 1917 wasn't giving anyone a state. We were keeping the land for ourselves.
Yes, I mean, in the period when Britain imagined that it could keep its colonies forever. Yes.
The earlier, if you like, the early restorationists certainly from the 1810s around to about 1860, 1870, were convinced that the Jewish people would be returned, the facilitation would occur for the return of the Jewish people as a Christian nation, as a Protestant Christian nation. So the Palestine Exploration Fund was in part founded to help facilitate that process. The British Army was used to map Palestine to help facilitate that return. The first Anglican bishopric, a joint bishopric with the Lutherans in Germany, Shaftesbury and others insisted that it had to be a Jewish Anglican in the belief that the Jewish people would come to faith, become good Anglicans. But as that didn't happen, as the Zionist movement emerged that was largely secular, and it was the religious Zionists who the religious Jews who oppose Zionism, that a more pragmatic approach occurs. And as we see in the Balfour Declaration, it's a much more nuanced declaration to help further Britain's agenda in the Middle East.
So Christian Zionism did play a significant role in at least influencing the views of the British elite.
I believe so, yes, very much so.
Now let's jump closer to the present. You showed us Pastor John Hagee, who's president of the Southern Baptist Convention, celebrating the strength of the Israeli state to supposedly defend itself from its mortal enemy, Iran. And perhaps that's well known, but less well known may be a quotation from John Hagee, who said, "Adolf Hitler was a hunter sent by God, who was tasked with the expediting God's will of having the Jews reestablish the state of Israel." Might this be interpreted as anti-Semitic and perhaps exemplifying wider anti-Semitic views among Christian Zionists?
I think Hagee would deny that, but what I think we're observing is, just as we saw with Lord Balfour, his personal prejudices coming through in his domestic policy, but the more pragmatic geopolitical agenda of extending the British Empire dominating the Balfour Declaration. In the same way, I think we see in Hagee and some of his colleagues, there is a prejudice, certainly in the Southern Baptists and many Southern Baptists and white evangelicals, a prejudice toward blacks, towards immigrants, towards refugees, and dare I say it, to the Jewish people. But at the same time, the belief that their theological understanding is that God is blessing America because America blesses Israel. And so he may have a personal prejudice toward Jews, but that statement you quoted is a reflection of his eschatology's view of the future, which is we're heading for a war of Armageddon, and God will use any means to get his people back to the land, whether it's a Hitler or a Balfour. So what my observation there is that if you have a very fixed theological framework, and we see this in the 19th century when they were dating the return of the Messiah to 1840, 1847, and they were, the Jehovah's Witnesses, 1918. That way of reading the future, where you look at dates, you look at numbers, you look at Ezekiel, Revelation, so Daniel, that means that when you look at something that's happening today, you interpret it in the light of your view of the Bible. So the suffering of the Jewish people in the 1940s particularly was interpreted by some Christian leaders as Jacob's trouble. They looked in the Bible and they saw that suffering was part of God's plan. They shrugged their shoulders and said, well, it's happening. Now, I think we need to step outside that framework and say, whatever's happening in the world today, God calls us to care for whoever is suffering, whoever's in need, whoever's being persecuted, whether it's Muslims or Jews or those of another faith. But yes, I think you're right. We see again this mixture of prejudice and theological framework, but also a political agenda. He realizes which side his bread is buttered, and he's a leading advocate, as Jerry Falwell was for 50 years, on behalf of Israel.
Well, further to the 1940s, when many Jews in Nazi-occupied areas, or those that may become occupied, wanted to get out, of course, they wanted to go to North America. But Zionist organizations lobbied those governments to restrict immigration so that Jews would have no alternative but to go to Palestine. I mean, that's fairly well documented. But what was the role of Christian Zionist organizations in that period, as regards Jewish immigration to their own countries?
That's a much harder question to answer. You find during the First World War through to the 1950s, you find evangelicals preoccupied with evolution, creation, with male and female relationships. There are internal tensions, and you find they go cold on the Zionist movement. The most influential Christian writers who were advocating for the Zionist movement in that period were liberals theologically, not evangelicals. It was really from 1967 when Nelson Bell, father-in-law of Billy Graham, was editor of Christianity Today. He said the Bible's coming true, Bible prophecy is coming true, and you see a revival in Christian Zionism from the mid-1960s. Jerry Falwell has an epiphany. Before 1967, Jerry Falwell repudiated politics. Post-1967, he becomes the leading advocate on behalf of Israel. So there's clear evidence of anti-Semitic sentiment among some Christian leaders in the 1940s. They were reluctant to encourage the Jewish people to leave Germany, or at least to leave and go to Palestine or to the States. But during that period, the advocates for Israel tended to be those of the more liberal theological persuasion.
So the 67 war and what became Israel's permanent occupation became a turning point for the revival of an evangelical Christian Zionism.
Yes.
I mean, identifying with the war and anticipating, encouraging more war to fulfill.
Exactly. Yes. There's one passage they love to quote in particular, where Jesus predicts that Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the end times. And so if you like, the liberation of Jerusalem in 1967 was seen as, again, Bible prophecy coming true. And when you tap into that, you find Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth selling over 50 million copies. And Tim LaHaye, the Left Behind books, all writing about today as if today is the day before the Messiah comes.
Because you had limited time in the initial talk, perhaps you omitted what we might call the progressive pro-Palestine strands of Christianity. Perhaps you could tell us a little about those efforts, and then I'll add a question about how they come into conflict with Christian Zionists.
I'd be pleased to do that. Can I split my screen again?
Oh, yeah.
Do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Thankfully, the church leaders in Palestine and Jerusalem, particularly, have challenged this movement and issued a statement about 10 years ago repudiating Christian Zionism. This was signed by the heads of all the leading denominations in Jerusalem, rejecting Christian Zionism and calling for the church in other countries to repudiate this, if you like, alignment, political alignment between the US and Israel. They said, rather than condemn the world to doom of Armageddon, we call upon everyone to liberate themselves from ideologies of militarism and occupation, and instead pursue the healing of the nations. And out of that movement has grown what's called the Kairos movement. And this, again, is made up of Christian leaders and Christians from all the mainstream denominations in Palestine. And they've issued a series of declarations which have been taken up by church leaders around the world, and in the UK by two groups that have recently merged, Sabeel and Kairos. And I was part of the group that helped to write the response to the Kairos declaration, calling upon Britain, for example, to apologize for the Balfour Declaration, to engage in non-violent resistance, BDS, and so on. And so there is a counter movement to Christian Zionism within the mainstream denominations in the UK and in the States and other countries. And so I'll just come out of that now. All I would say is we are a small movement, and we are heavily targeted by Zionist groups and accused of anti-Semitism increasingly because we stand up for the rights of Palestine and Palestinians.
And Sabeel Kairos has been promoting a campaign for morally responsible investment, covering a broad range of issues such as the arms trade, tobacco, which has been fairly straightforward to implement in many churches, except the issue of Palestine, meaning church investments in companies which are complicit in the occupation. So perhaps you could tell us, and of course, sometimes this hits the headlines, such a few years ago, the Methodists made a decision in this country to divest from such funds. And then last year, the Quakers. Perhaps you could tell us how those victories were achieved despite the accusations against them, and how the conflict arises within those churches.
I can really only speak for the Church of England, but I was part of the Interfaith Group for Morally Responsible Investment here in the UK, IMRI, and we drew up a strategy, a campaign, and we decided to target Caterpillar, and in particular the Church of England's investments in Caterpillar, because the D9 bulldozer is an armor-plated weapon, twice the height of it's the size of a double-decker bus. The blade on the front is 6 feet high. They would add tear gas launches, machine guns, turrets. It was weaponized basically, and if you want to get the Church of England General Synod to make a decision, you need at least 100 signatures it has to go through various committees, and it's very hard to make any changes. But you can ask a question of a statement that's being made or a document that's being published by the Church of England with a couple of signatures. And we engaged with the Ethical Investment Advisory Group, EIAG, and I debated one of their leaders over the Church of England's shares in Caterpillar, challenging them at a public debate about how unethical it was for the Church of England to be profiting from this company. We managed to get a question raised at General Synod. I helped to write a paper. It was put in all the pigeonholes the night before General Synod. And we had a quote from the Bishop of Jerusalem challenging the Church of England to sell its shares in Caterpillar. And we managed to get the Archbishop of Canterbury to side with those who wanted to sell the shares in Caterpillar. And the majority decision of General Synod was to do so. And we thought we've won, we've succeeded. But the board responsible for the investments of the Church of England politely declined to sell the shares because they argued that they had a responsibility to the Charity Commission not to lose money, but they quietly sold those shares in Caterpillar a year later. So that was an example of how we managed to get a change. I understand that the Archbishop of Canterbury, our present Archbishop, regretted that decision to sell the shares in Caterpillar, I believe, but we succeeded. We've also been engaged with various groups to campaign against G4S, Harbour, Veolia, and other companies that, if you like, exploit the occupation.
I mean, you've given examples of how some of the church elite oppose divestment, perhaps wishfully thinking that the investment can help them bring the company away from its immoral practices. But more specifically about Christian Zionism, have such forces been able to intervene and block divestment?
They've tried to criminalize and demonize BDS, but they've not really engaged directly with the BDS movement. If you like, the Hasbro manual on how you tackle those of us who are committed to human rights and international law is that you seek to intimidate and target the individuals until they give in. And if they won't give in, you then move to a second strategy, which is to isolate them by intimidating others. So I've been involved in half a dozen or a dozen, between a half a dozen and a dozen Christian organizations, and each one of them has been targeted by Zionists, urging them to disassociate from me. Alleging, for example, that I'm anti-Semitic in my views, which I would repudiate strongly. And they've been successful with various organizations because these organizations don't want to lose their funding or they are self-conscious about their image. So that's the strategy. It's intimidate and then isolate. And if that doesn't work, then they seek to incriminate. And bring in the authorities, bring in the police. The Council of Christians and Jews made a complaint against me to the police. The police visited me and I said, well, aren't you going to take a statement? They said, we don't want you to give us a statement because we'd have to caution you and that would give ammunition to the opposition. The police knew darn well what the agenda was. And if you go to the website of CCJ, Council of Christians and Jews, they notified their constituency that they've reported me to the police, and they stated that the police have informed us of the outcome of their investigation, but they wouldn't admit that the police had thrown out the investigation. So if you like, there's no smoke without fire. He must be guilty because the police have investigated. But that's their tactic. Intimidate, isolate, incriminate, but never address the issue directly. always seek to undermine the speaker, not challenge the message. Go for the needs.
And to frighten potential supporters, because it's easier to frighten them than the self-confident activists.
There's one organization I was a trustee of for about 25 years. I won't name them. I was a director and trustee for 25 years. And one of the leaders came to me one day on the phone. He said, Stephen, we're updating the website. Do you mind if we don't put your name on as one of our trustees? I said, you can do what you like. I don't care about my name being on the website. But they were clearly paranoid about losing money, even though I'd been serving them for 25 years. You get used to it. I gave a talk. I was invited to give a talk at one of the colleges in Cambridge, St. Peter's College, and I think it's St. Peter's. And the chaplain phoned me up about a week before. He said, Stephen, I don't know how to put this. And I said, I know exactly what you're going to say. You've been asked to cancel my participation. He said, it's worse than that. I've got to justify my existence in the college for having invited you. I said, that's really unusual. He said, strange, because I've just supervised, helped to examine a thesis for a student at Oxford University, and I've just recently spoken to the Jewish Society at Cambridge University. He said, oh, send me the details. So I sent the details. 3 days before the event, he said, you've been re-invited. But I had to meet with one of the Jewish leaders in the university before the event to make sure I was acceptable. But you just get used to it. I'm sure you know that you've experienced the same.
If you're prepared for the onslaught, then yes, you can figure out how to deal with it. So maybe I'll resist temptation to ask more questions, because we have some from our other participants. So.
Okay, are you going to hand over to me, Les?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I forgot. That's Cher's role.
Okay. Yes, we've got a few questions and a bit more time. So I'd appreciate some answers from the following. Firstly, from Claire, who asks a couple of questions. One is, what proportion of Christians believe in Christian Zionism? Do you know that, Stephen?
I'm sorry, David, I didn't hear the question.
Okay, again, what proportion of Christians believe in Christian Zionism?
It's very hard to say. In the US, the Pew Forum for Religion recently did a survey, and they found that 25% of American Christians believe it's their responsibility to support the nation of Israel. But when you narrow that down to white evangelicals, it was 63%. So a significant proportion of Christians in the US would identify with Christian Zionism. When Hagee talks about 50 million, I don't think he's exaggerating.
Thank you. And a follow-up question from Claire. Is there any open resistance amongst Christian leaders to this doctrine? You've talked about the church in Jerusalem, but is there any broader resistance?
I know a number of Anglican bishops who are quite critical of Zionism, Christian Zionism in particular, but they're all retired. I don't personally know a single serving Anglican priest who has publicly criticized Christian Zionism, who's actually serving in a parish. There are academics. When I wrote my book, Christian Zionism, I could count on one hand the authors, Christian authors, who dared address the subject. And that number hasn't increased significantly since then. So although privately, many Christian leaders that I speak to share sentiments, they're very reluctant to go public on it.
a bit depressing. Okay, thank you for that. Another question from Maggie. Many thanks for your excellent PowerPoint, Stephen. Can you explain more about the millennialist theories? With a second coming, what is the eventual outcome for the Jews?
There are 4 different eschatologies, views of the future: amillennial, premillennial, postmillennial, and dispensational. Essentially, the Reformed churches are either amillennial or postmillennial, and they have largely a view of the future that is peaceful, that yes, wars will continue till the end, there will be conflict, there will be suffering, but God is in control and good will triumph over evil. Premillennialism became very popular in the 19th century, particularly in Britain, as a result of the conflicts with Napoleon, with the French, and turmoil in Europe. Premillennialism, the idea that the world is getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and then there'll be a final battle, and then Jesus returns, or the Messiah will come. That became a dominant view, and that's probably the most popular view in the US. The fourth group, called dispensationalism, their view arose out of the teachings of John Nelson Darby, who founded the Brethren, helped to found the Brethren. Their view is that God has, when God says to Abraham, your descendants will be like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, here his colleagues argue, well, the stars are the Christians and the sand is the Jews. So a heavenly people and an earthly people. So you end up with like railway lines that go on into eternity and never the twain shall meet. And that's very popular in the US, Dallas Theological Seminary, the Moody Bible Institute. Those are some of the organizations that promoted this idea of God having 2 peoples, not 1. And that has given rise to much of the Christian Zionist movement. I'm a pan-millennialist. I believe it will all pan out in the end, that I do believe the Messiah is coming, but I believe we should live as if he's coming tomorrow, and if I'm not put off till tomorrow what we should be doing today. What does the Lord require of us but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God? He's called us, those of us who follow Jesus, he's called us to be peacemakers, not widowmakers. He's called us to reconciliation, not confrontation. And so whatever's going to happen in the future, I know my responsibility is to share in practical ways God's love with anyone who is in need, whether they deserve it or not.
Thank you. I've got another question from Rodney, who is signed in as Phil, so I'm not sure exactly who it is, but would Stephen comment on the fact that there are many left-wing evangelicals who are anti or non-Zionist? I personally, he says, have to keep on objecting to being labelled with the right wing, especially as my heritage is Jewish.
Yes, I mean, for me, that's where the hope lies. It's those who have a clear understanding of Scripture, maybe conservative theologically, but radical or liberal politically. How we apply our faith, is the test, if you like. We've got to walk the talk, and yes, some of the most outspoken critics of Christian Zionism are Bible-loving, respectful, who accept the historic faith of the church. Bethlehem Bible College, for example, in Bethlehem, is a beacon of this. They hold a conference every 2 years called Christ at the Checkpoint. And they invite speakers from all over the world to speak about justice, about reconciliation, and they address things like the wall, the settlements, and they get targeted mercilessly by Zionist groups for taking that stand.
Okay, thank you. And I have another question from Ronit, who says, first of all, excellent talk, thanks for that. Is it true that some Christian Zionists believe that the Jews in Palestine should either convert or be killed?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Some Christians should?
I will, yeah. Is it true that some Christian Zionists believe that the Jews in Palestine should either convert or be killed? Convert to Christianity, I assume, or be killed?
You do find that view, particularly, I would say, in the States and among folk who've never traveled outside the community, who do not know Jewish people, do not know Palestinians, you know, whose worldview is a very narrow and closed one that revolves around their church and their family and their view of American exceptionalism. I very rarely encounter that kind of prejudice from people who've engaged with people of other faiths, so who've traveled to Israel or Palestine. Invariably, they come back much more sober and much more passionate about justice, peace, and reconciliation.
Okay. And I've got another question from Claire. Ask Stephen to describe how he has been targeted and prevented from being a practicing priest.
I would love
Personal
to,
background.
but some of what I would like to share, I can't yet.
Okay, interesting.
I was the subject of a clergy disciplinary measure in 2012. The Board of Deputies of British Jews brought a complaint against me, and my bishop at the time took their complaint very seriously, as he should, and he heard my defense, my repudiation of racism and all forms of prejudice, including anti-Semitism. I had about 40 colleagues, including Jewish rabbis and bishops, who defended me. It's all on my website. If you go to my website, stephensizer.com, look under friends, you'll see them all listed there, including Jeremy Corbyn. I got him into trouble because when they targeted him recently, they used me and a few others to try and discredit him, but we won't go there today. But my bishop at the time decided to seek conciliation, meaning sit down together and discuss the issue and seek a solution. And thankfully, at the time, we were successful. We agreed on a statement, and the Board of Deputies withdrew their complaint. And I had promised prior to that that if they had any problems with anything I wrote or said, if they came to me, I would take it seriously and I would address it, but not to go public without asking me first. And I agreed that I'd have people check my output, if you like, friends who would do the same, give me constructive criticism. And that worked quite well for a short period of time. But that's common sense, that if you have a disagreement with someone, go direct to them and address it with them first. You don't go public. So the complaint was withdrawn. Things have happened since then, but I can't really go into those at the moment, but perhaps next year I'll be able to elaborate further if you invite me back.
Intriguing, yes, certainly. Okay, you mentioned the word reconciliation, and I'm wondering if you draw any conclusions or hope from the fact of the Archbishop's announcement this week to have a sabbatical to research reconciliation. Anyway, I'll leave that hanging. I've got a question from Haim, who says, what do you think of the chances of a movement supporting Palestine, which brings Christians, Muslims, and Jews together?
I am very supportive of ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, who are committed to one democratic state in Palestine of Jews and Palestinians. Whether it's one state or two or a federation, it is, it's not for us to tell the Palestinians what they should accept, but it's got to be based on international law, and it's got to be based on treating everyone equally, and acknowledging the injustices of the occupation, the settlements, the wall, and so on. And so I support the one state solution now, because I believe the two states is dead. It's been dead for a number of years. The settlements have continued to expand. The wall, in effect, is creating ghettos for Palestinians in Hebron, Nablus, Jenin, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, and so on. It's unsustainable and it's unacceptable. But the solution's got to be peaceful and democratic.
You mentioned the two-state solution is dead. Some people would argue even further than that. It's a distraction. It's actually enabling Greater Israel to piecemeal develop. That's all the questions I've got from our participants, but I've got a question myself, which is, how much do Christian Zionists know about Israeli oppression of Palestinian Christians?
It's a good question. I think, it's hard to answer a question like that in general terms. We had an international conference in about 2012 in Jerusalem on Christian Zionism, and I gave a presentation there. It's about 300 or 400 participants from around the world. And I said, put your hand up if you would have regarded yourself as a Christian Zionist in the past. Half the hands went up. So I took that as a hopeful sign that people are moving in one direction. I've yet to meet someone who has been to Palestine, knows Palestinians, has witnessed the occupation, and then become a Christian Zionist. It's the other way around. And that's why speaking out and telling what we have seen, what we've heard, is so important. One way I do that is my face covering is designed to spark conversation. And I've had a number of conversations with my post office, the staff of the post office, who are from the Middle East, who are pleased to see my face covering. So yeah, showing solidarity with Israeli Jews, with Israeli Palestinians, with West Bank Palestinians who are committed to a just and lasting peace based on international law, is the way forward.
Fingers firmly crossed.
Can I add a question?
Well, sorry, Les. Yeah, Les, carry on.
Yeah. From what I understand, I mean, there are strongly committed social justice activists in the churches, and they have persevered in the campaign for divestment, I mean, especially on Palestine, because that's where they encounter the greatest resistance or reluctance in the churches, and they have had some victories, and they will continue to persevere. But as you said, the intimidation campaign is directed at potential supporters, in order to isolate them. So I want to ask whether there's some way that Jewish pro-Palestine groups could help to overcome that intimidation of potential supporters.
I think that the way I find what I find most encouraging is the fearless way in which many Israeli Jews speak out on this issue. The Women in Black, for example, and other groups within Israeli society that are challenging the occupation. I read Haaretz newspaper regularly, and I sometimes I do a double take and I think, wow, you're saying things that I could never dare say, because if I did, I would pay dearly for it. So I think I would want to encourage my Israeli friends to be fearless in speaking out on what they know and what they see, because it must encourage our Palestinian friends, but also strengthens those of us in the West who want to advocate for them.
And how about closer to home? Given the systematic intimidation of people who do or might support the divestment campaign here, I mean, how could Jewish groups here help to soften or overcome that intimidation?
I think they are. I think that I mean, Jewish Voice for Peace, Jews for Justice for Palestine, those within the political parties, particularly the Lib Dems and Labour, I think are doing fantastic work. Yes, we could do more, but I think this opportunity we're having today, where those of different faiths and none are finding common cause, is the way forward. And the more we can do that, the better. I work closely with a number of Muslim organizations, these ICAD, the Internet.
Islamic Human Rights Commission.
Yes, Islamic Human Rights Commission, IHRC, is one example where, you know, I'm heartened that Jews, Muslims, and Christians are working together to advocate for human rights in various countries, including Palestine.
Okay. If there are no more questions, it falls to me to thank Stephen.
Thank you.
Very deeply for his contribution. I was particularly interested to learn that Christian Zionism actually predated Jewish Zionism. I was also grateful, Stephen, that you reduced your 122 slides down to a more manageable size. Thank you for that. And also thanks for all your political activism. You talk about being intimidated and isolated and incriminated and even police action. So, you know, you're working on a number of levels, and we really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Today you've mentioned a couple of intriguing points which you're not able to discuss more, but you would like to come back, and we'd love to have you. So I'm going to leave it to you to tell us when it's appropriate to re-invite you, and we'll be very pleased to do that. So thank you very much for your talk today. And I just want to point out to our participants that tomorrow is International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. And I've just posted 2 events on JNP's Facebook page. One is a webinar with the director of the UNRWA Medical Center at the Shufat refugee camp. And JNP's sister organization tomorrow in the USA is partnering with the Palestine Solidarity Committee and the BDS National Committee for an online rally. So all the details of that are on our Facebook page. And in addition to that, next Saturday at 5 o'clock, we've got our 3rd webinar. So watch out for details of that. And also there are details on our Facebook page about how to join JNP. So have a look at that as well. So thanks to Stephen for his fascinating contribution, and to Les, and to Haim, and the rest of JNP's steering group, but especially Haim, who has initiated the JNP series of webinars. And thanks to all the participants for joining us, and please stay in touch.